Well, this talk is also going to be about tsunami generation, but at the same time, it's going to talk about the modeling of the subduction zone in a kind of a novel way, using GPS data assimilation in order to get a better model of the deformation, uplift, subsidence, which is the co-seismic part. Then there are also some novel aspects of the tsunami modeling itself in order to better capture the wave generation. And then when all of this is done, we see that for this extremely catastrophic tsunami that goes to Tohoku, we still cannot explain the very large run-up in inundation along the Senriku coast that reached over 40 meters. And so we've been looking for other seabed processes that could perhaps be responsible for additional tsunami generation that could explain those observations. Now, our group, our little team is multidisciplinary. Myself and my postdoc Jeff, we are sort of modeling the tsunami and the coastal impact and looking at the other seabed processes. Dave Toppin is a specialist of geology and underwater landslides, and then the last group in Delaware has been more involved in wave model developments. So as you all know, this latest catastrophic tsunami off of Japan caused enormous destruction, and it's very important to understand all the mechanisms that were involved in its generation in order to better understand future events and possibly better mitigate them. So it's all about saving future lives and reducing damage. Now, of course, Japan was very well prepared, and you can see on the upper left picture one of the seawalls that somewhat mitigated the effect of the tsunami in some places. We slowed down or retarded the effect, but many ended up failing anyway. Many of you are very familiar with the seismotectonic context of this area. The Pacific plate is subducting under the Oshkosh plate at about 8 centimeters per year. And you can see the rupture area over here. This is the epicenter, but these are all the different aftershocks and so forth. So the rupture area was about 500 kilometers long by 200 kilometers wide. And of course, the first mechanism that you have to look at for tsunami generation is the modeling of the seafloor deformation that's co-seismic. Once the slip releases the accumulated deformation, we are going to have areas of uplift, areas of subsidence, and this is going to be heterogeneous in space and time. So it's also important to consider that aspect in the modeling. So the triggering of the tsunami shouldn't be done as a whole, as we just heard about Sumatra, which in that case took about 10 minutes. Here, the main rupture lasted about for three minutes, but there were other places rupturing even later. So it's important to look at that aspect as well. Then once we have that part covered, we have to look at tsunami generation, the generation part. Now, traditionally, tsunami generation is done by simply taking the seafloor deformation and using it as a start in a wave model without any velocity. Now, we found out in this particular case that it was actually important to do a three-dimensional model here and not simply transport the seafloor deformation on the surface. So we not only do it dynamically in space and time, but we also trigger the tsunami on the seafloor. And because we are going to look at some smaller scale seabed processes such as submarine mass failure, it's very important to also trigger the water movement by directly specifying the seafloor deformation. Then there's the propagation part. Now, very quickly, a tsunami becomes a set of very long waves, so you can use a two-dimensional horizontal model for that. But again, because the physics we are going to deal with is a little bit more complicated than usual, these waves will be dispersive. There will be shorter waves involved. So we need to use a model that has frequency dispersion and nonlinearity. And then finally, for the coastal impact, we have to deal with also different processes of wetting, drying, run-up, and so forth. So there are really 4 different pieces. The subduction zone itself, the tsunami generation, propagation, and then coastal impact. We can learn about the rupture by looking at the seismic inversion models. Uh-oh, that's a good start. I think when I switch to the projector, it's somehow lost. All right, so this is from a seismic inversion model that shows you the rupture in time and space. So for the first three minutes, it occurred mostly to the south here. By the way, the Senriku coast is up here, and there is not a lot of co-seismic action going on. So despite this area being the most impacted, we see that the main rupture, which is further south, doesn't generate nearly enough waves to the north to actually explain for that. So all these parameters have been obtained very quickly in the first week or so through seismic inversion. Then about the tsunami itself, there were lots of observations, not only at deep water buoys called DART, but also at so-called GPS buoys, which were in fairly shallow water, a couple 100 to 150 meters of depth off of Japan. There were 9 of those. And then there were extensive field surveys, international surveys. Some people in the room participated in those that provided run-up in inundation. So you can see the peak run-up inundation reaching 40 meters to the north here along the Senriku coast. In the Sendai plain, it's 10 to 20 meters. These are some pictures that the international team took, and you can see some areas where the barriers, the protection barriers got destroyed. Here's a place where run-up was 32 meters. So the traditional subduction zone model is fairly simplistic. It's still, in most cases, based on the half-plane solution of Okada, 1985, which assumes a simple fault described by simple parameters. And then with the semi-analytic solution of the half-plane elasticity, you can given a slip and given the fault parameters, you can predict a seafloor deformation. And if you use a number of those sources or slip patches, you can have a solution such as this, which was produced by USGS within a few days of the event. So you can see where the slip reaching up to 40, 50 meters here in some places occurred. And that's based on an inversion of, I guess, about 200 seismographs, measuring the seismic waves and then using those Okada sources, reproducing the slip corresponding to the rupture. Now, in our case, we use a more advanced representation of the subduction zone based on finite elements. And we also do an inverse model that will assimilate GPS measurements, so deformation on land and deformation underwater that were measured. And the finite element model accounts for a more complex geometry of both the forearc and the different parts of the subduction zone, and also the inhomogeneity of the material. So you have basaltic material, you have less dense material. Those will act differently once deformed, and they will affect the seafloor deformation. So very quickly, how those inverse models work. If you have the simple one fold slip here, and you want to predict deformation of the surface, given a slip, with a simple Green's function, you can relate the movement of the fault to the displacement on the surface. So that's what we call a forward model. Now, if we have an observation, we can then do an inverse model, and given the known movement on the surface, you can infer what the slip is, also using the Green's function. Now, if you have that Green's function, then it will be function of some geometrical parameters of the fault, its orientation and size and so forth. And then the slip would be simply estimated, in this case, with one parameter as a simple inversion. Now, if you have more observations, then you have a system of equations that have to provide the slip. And if you have more observations than equations, of course, you do a least square method to get a unique slip. Now, if you have a complex displacement pattern, you need more than one slip patch. So you use multiple slip patches, which means you will have multiple Green's functions. So again, you can do a direct model, and you have a series of observations and then a series of slip fold patches. And so you have a rectangular matrix that again can be solved using least square method, and it will give you the slip of the different patches. Now, there is one more thing to worry about. It is the smoothness of the slips. Now, if you have independent patches, there is no reason for them to have a smooth variation of slip from one to another, whereas in nature, slip is not going to jump around so much. So you need to constrain the solution somewhat. Now, an unconstrained solution for two neighboring patches could give you two different movements that could very well match perfectly an observation, but still those two movements would be discontinuous. So in order to constrain that, you are going to use patches that don't differ so much from each other, and you're not going to match perfectly the observation. This is going to be done through smoothing. Now, in our case, we use a Laplacian operator for smoothing, which is a constraint we put upon the solution. So now you have two sets of equations. You have the inversion of the observations to provide the slip, and then you have a constraint to provide smoothness. And there is a control parameter. So if that parameter is 0, you have no smoothness, you have a perfect fit. If this parameter is infinite, you have no fit, and you have perfect smoothness. So this parameter is sort of providing a solution which is on this L-shaped curve, and we define the optimal value of beta at that apex of the curve. Now, the Green's function can be produced. Either we could use the Okada method to get the Green's function, or in our case, because we want to take into account the more complex nature of the subduction zone, we use finite element solution. And that finite element solution basically will provide all those Green's functions, but accounting for a more complex mechanical model of the subduction zone and a more complex geometry. So now, the Green's function in the same set of equations are generated by the finite element, and we can then solve for a complex medium. So in the case of Tohoku, this was done, and it's in a paper that's online in Pure and Applied Geophysics. So this part, you can find all the details. We used 6 different materials, and these are the material constants of those materials, a large number of elements. And then we used GPS observations. There were only 5 clean GPS observations underwater and about 500 on land. And this provided the slip distribution of the Tohoku event. So here you can see the fit between the prediction and the observations with the 2 sigma circles in here. So you can see that all those vectors match the observations at the places where we have them. And here now, this is the horizontal deformation, and then for the vertical deformation, we predict a maximum of slightly over 11 meters. Now, how does this solution differ from a more simplistic approach? Well, we have one here on the right-hand side, which we call the University of California source, which was one of the better sources based on seismic inversion. You can see that our source predicts uplift to subsidence transition. Uplift is red, subsidence is blue, closer to shore as compared to that source. So this is somewhat better to account for the observation. So, and that source kind of over-predicted uplift, and we will see when we use that source to also simulate the tsunami, it over-predicts the tsunami in many places. So the last step is what I showed you is a static solution. So it's not a dynamic subsidence model, it's a static deformation model. So we wanted to have a dynamic pattern of the slip, and that was obtained from the seismic inversion time series. It's a time-dependent seismic inversion of U and Lake. So these are in time how our slip is being triggered, and now we can look at tsunami generation. So for the tsunami generation, as I said, we use 2 models, one 3-dimensional for the source and 2-dimensional for the propagation. The 3-dimensional model can also be used to model underwater landslides, as you see here. So here down on that frame, this is a model of that experiment. So using this model to generate the tsunami, you use that three-dimensional model in that large box, which is a 1,000 meter grid scale. Then we nest into 250 meter, and then eventually on the Senriku coast into a 50 meter grid model that also has a very accurate bathymetry and topography. For the ocean scale propagation, we do 2 to 4 minutes on a spherical grid, but I'm not going to emphasize that too much. These are the sources of bathymetry. And so you can see here the far field model that propagates the tsunami in a number of hours, of course, as we know, and then the near field model that is in the smaller box. So I'm going to look mostly at the near field, but before that, I will just mention briefly that we use the dispersive model for the far field as well, which is not typical. And the white picture here shows a difference between dispersive and non-dispersive results. So this is the envelope of maximum waves on a scale of 1 meter. So the tsunami in deep water is not very tall, of course. But you can see that there are up to 10 centimeter plus or minus differences when you simulate the tsunami with or without dispersion. That is not small. So this is something to consider also in the future. And we compare the size of Coriolis effects versus dispersive effects. So back to, some results in the far field, say, for instance, off of Oregon State. You're going to have in colors here, the black is the observation, red is the finite element co-seismic source, and the other one is the seismic inversion, more traditional. In the far field, the two different sources are not producing very different results. So they agree quite well with results in Hawaii and Oregon State, not so well off of South America, but that's what most people find. Now in the near shore, of course, that's quite different. So if we look at all those different GPS buoys, now to the north, whether you have that more complex finite element source or not doesn't make a big difference. Now off of the Iwate prefecture here, the three GPS sources, GPS buoys, show you the black observation where you have those shorter waves oscillating. The big blue waves are that seismic inversion, which kind of overpredicts everything. Our solution, the red one, just matches the long wave component quite well. It does it for all the buoys, but it does not match the higher frequency waves. Now, the seismic inversion here overpredicts everything. And the dark buoys, if I look at the one closest to Japan, same thing, the red solution kind of matches the long wave feature. The blue solution overpredicts the long wave feature. If we look at inundation and run-up, on the middle is observations, on the right is our source. We kind of match observations quite well up to about 39 degrees, and we overpredict significantly the measurements in Senriku. We only find about 10 meters instead of 40 meters. For the seismic inversion, it overpredicts quite a lot, even in the south, but it also does not explain the large observations in Senriku. So we have, this is in terms of inundation only, our source or the seismic inversion source, and the observations are way above both of these. So we have large unexplained run-ups. So we've been looking for other explanations, and one of them, people have suggested slow slips, plate faults, or submarine mass failures that could be triggered by some seismic effects. So we looked at submarine mass failure for one reason. In our early work, as you've seen in the laboratory experiments, we dealt with submarine mass failure, and they usually produce very concentrated run-up on the shore. That's what we observed. They also produce higher frequency waves or shorter waves. That these were observed and not explained. So we had kind of a few observations to put us on the track. And then some cruises that were post-tsunami surveyed and observed large seafloor motion near the epicenter. This is published in March in JRL. Huge area where up to 7 to 9 meters of seafloor deformation were observed. And then some cruises that were post-tsunami surveyed and observed large seafloor motion near the epicenter. This is published in March in JRL. Huge area where up to 7 to 9 meters of seafloor deformation were observed. So we have kind of a few observations to put us on the track. And then some cruises So these are different observations placed in different contexts. So we followed the submarine mass failure hypothesis, and to locate it first, we did a traditional travel time analysis, but it's not so traditional because we only took the higher frequency peak of the waves that were unexplained, the 3 to 4 minute waves off of Iwaki's buoys, and we followed them backwards in time using a dispersive ray tracing, not the long wave ray tracing. And then the dark buoy ray tracing gave us an area in here off of Senriku where those waves originated. And there is no co-seismic displacement there really caused by the earthquake. The cruise I was mentioning, the GRL paper, is here, slightly further south. Then we looked at seafloor slope, and they are in the area where the travel time indicates the source. We found very large slopes, and we did a simplified slope stability analysis using seismic triggering, and we found that the lowest factor of safety for those slopes was here as well. So we sized a mass failure in this area of about 40 by 20 kilometers and 2 kilometers thick, which using the observations as a guide to size the movement of the mass failure, we decided to model it as a rotational movement of about 300 meter displacement. It's a fairly short displacement. And using travel time, we triggered it after about 2 minutes and 15 seconds after the main rupture. So, and this is what you obtain. Now, you have the main rupture and then the mass failure. The main rupture is basically a non-dispersive wave that's going to reach the dark buoy here and reaches the Iwaki's buoy. The submarine mass failure causes a set of dispersive waves. You can count about 6 major waves in here. And these should be retrieved in observations. So now when you look at observations, and I'm going to compare our co-seismic source, no submarine mass failure, and then the same source plus the slump. So the no slump, just co-seismic is red, with the slump is blue, and black is the data. So you can see the red explains the long wave features, and now at the Iwaki buoys, our combined solution matches the data quite well at the 3 Iwaki buoys here, and then the dark buoy here. If you have no mass failure, you get the red solution, and if you have the mass failure, you get the blue solution, and then the black is the data. So you can see there is quite a good match here as well. We did a wavelength analysis. So wavelength is a time frequency analysis that can show you in which frequency range there is energy. Up here is the observation. So you can see at the Iwaki buoy, you have quite a bit of energy at high frequency. Now, B is our source, co-seismic plus slump, and you can see it also has the energy where it needs to be. If you don't have the mass failure, you don't have the high frequency energy. And the Caltech source, which is one of the recent better seismic sources, doesn't have the high frequency energy either. At the dark buoy, same thing. Data, our solution without the mass failure, and the Caltech solution. So no high energy either here. Finally, and I'm almost done here, the inundation on a 50-meter grade in the very complex Senriku Valley. This is the 2 Iwaki buoys that we've already talked about, and that's where run-up reached 40-45 meters. So now, if we compare all the observations, all the dots, black dots are observations, and the red line is our combined source, it doesn't do a bad job in matching the observations in terms of penetration of the inundation. And now finally, at the top you have inundation data, the black dots. At the bottom, run-up data. Then the red line is a co-seismic solution only, so it matches the data quite well except in Senriku. Then when we add the mass failure, you get the blue solution, which doesn't differ from the red further south or north, but produces this run-up and inundation that match observations quite well along those 80 kilometers of Senriku coast. So, short of a direct observation of the mass failure, that's where we are at this stage. So, using all the other observation that was available, we developed the best possible co-seismic source using this novel approach based on finite element with data assimilation. And that source, compared to 3 or 4 of the other sources that have already been published, better explains the long-wave features of the tsunami than the other sources in itself. But none of the sources, whether ours or those other co-seismic sources, can explain the higher frequency waves. So these have to be due to other seabed processes on a shorter scale, owing to their shorter wavelengths and the different characteristics. It has to be originated further north than the main rupture. Now, people have done inversion of the observations, so not using a subduction zone model, and they were able to show that there is need, when you do that inversion, for triggering tsunami generation further north. But of course, when you do that, you don't have a physical explanation for it. So here we propose one. We used travel time, we used seafloor slope stability analysis, we used all the observations to try to size realistic mass failure. I should say that a paper suggested that the 1896 Henrico earthquake was also caused by a mixed source, that some semi-mass failure may have been responsible for some of it. And the parametrization is not tweaked to produce any observations on shore. It is just tweaked slightly to get the movement of the mass failure that explains the offshore observations, and then after that it's just pure modeling. So the last thing we are doing is trying to find observations. So we looked at all the pre-tsunami data that we could find in the region, and there are a few post-tsunami surveys, and we did some difference plots, and they are quite noisy. Now on the left-hand side is the difference between the average of the pre-tsunami bathymetry and the post-tsunami bathymetry, and you can see that there are gaps. On the right-hand side is the standard error calculated. So you can see that the error, the sigma, is about a third of the observation, but in the area where we place our mass failure, that big ellipse here, you can see that there is uplift up to 40 meters in here, and subsidence in the negative on this side, which is kind of the mechanism we have also assumed. Now, this is preliminary and very noisy, but of course, it would be very important to have direct observations, and I'm sure there are a lot of cruises going on in that area right now. So you can find a lot of information on the models in papers that have already been published. For the co-seismic part, as I said, there is a paper which is published online in Pure and Applied Geophysics, and all the part that's dealing with the semi-mass failure is just a manuscript in preparation. Thank you.
Thank you for the impressive talk. It's really amazing results. So for the topography that you just showed, is that ship-based topography?
Yeah.
Okay. And
it's multi-beam.
It's
multi-beam survey, but from 9 or 10 different sources.
Yeah. So could you do mapping for possible hazards from satellite bathymetry? Is it too low resolution?
Well, here we're looking for seafloor movement post-tsunami, so we need data that is on a scale of tens of meters. And if you talk about the e-topo bathymetry, it's a gravitational anomaly. It's not very accurate, particularly close to shore. I don't think it would be sensitive enough to give you that. Multi-beam and eventually coring would be the way to go.
And so for the submarine mass failure, did you model that event without the tsunami and just see what the run-up would be?
Yes, we did.
Independent
yeah,
of
we
the
did
tsunami?
both.
Do you still get 40 meters?
You get a little bit less perhaps because there is superposition of the two. So, but you still get mostly the mass failure causes that triangular run-up on Senriku, perhaps up to 30-35 meters. Interestingly, there was at another conference I recently attended, a Japanese group has looked at, in the Miyagi Bay, what caused the major hazard. They observed that there were low frequency and high frequency waves in the records without trying to understand their origin. they modeled them separately. And they showed that inside the bay, the low frequency component caused all the damage, which is the co-seismic tsunami. But outside, which is on Senriku, the high frequency waves, those that have 3-minute period and 6-8 meter amplitude at the GPS buoy, they caused all the damage outside. So we kind of concur, but now we have a mechanism to explain the generation of the high frequency waves.
So, and to do the slope stability analysis that you did, you need high resolution bathymetry data to.
Well, if you want,
because you could try to make a hazard map for all the coastlines. It seemed like the bigger hazard came from submarine mass failure for that part of Japan than the actual
in that
tsunami.
part, yes. If we are right,
there's lots of places that don't have, like the east coast of the North America has.
I'm actually working for NOAA, for the National Tsunami Hazard Mitigation Program, on mapping the entire East Coast for tsunami hazard, and a big part of it is underwater landslides. We're working with the USGS group in Woods Hole, Yuri Tenbrick's group, and we are working closely with them in mapping, getting all the sources and then modeling them to create tsunami undulation maps for New Jersey, Massachusetts, Rhode Island. So we are right in the middle of that. So you're right. For the East Coast particularly, I think the major hazard is from submarine mass failure. But in a megathrust event like this, where, of course, the tsunami, co-seismic tsunami was huge, if we are right, that additional contribution from the mass failure was bigger than the co-seismic tsunami to the north.
Regarding this map is on the left here. My understanding is, to read it correctly, you say that around the circular...
the elliptic, the one to the south here, this one.
Ah, the one to the south.
This one was another one we tried before, so this is the one we finally used, which has subsidence on that side and uplift on that side, because it does...
on both swaps?
On both swaps, yeah.
Because the southern one is more intensive. So, end of my comment, to clarify. Thank you.
But again, this data, we're still working on it. It's very preliminary.
Hi. I have a question for you and the previous speaker. Would it be possible to detect the smallest scale